Okay, so I want to make sure this is recording before I start because I just did this lecture and then realized there was an error at the beginning of the recording and it didn't actually record the lecture. So I spent half an hour talking to myself and it not recording, which is kind of a bummer. It seems like it is recording, so I'm going to go ahead. So the last time I taught this class online, not as a seated class, was in the summer. So all of the lectures that I recorded were for that online class. And when it's in the summer, it's so compressed in terms of time that I don't go into all of the topics that I like to go into when it's a seated class, a semester-long class. So a couple of the lectures I'm going to add now, okay, for the semester in modernism and in contemporary art. Okay, so this is one of those lectures. This is about the Gutai Group. So today we're going to talk about the Gutai Group, and first we need to know a little bit about what is happening in Japan after World War II. And so in this class, most of the class is very Western-centric, very Western Eurocentric. And I apologize for that. With only a semester and so much material to cover, it's really hard to do a good job of talking about everything happening globally in the art world. And if I had more time, I would definitely do more of that. And I apologize up front because I know it's very Eurocentric, which, so one of the things that I do in this class, as you know, is I like to provide some context historically at the beginning of each lecture so you know what's going on. And for this particular lecture, since it's about the Gutai Group, they're in Japan, and we haven't really talked about Japan at all this semester. So we're coming into a time in Japan that is full of lots and lots of change, right? It's after World War II. So this isn't a history class. This is going to be a very quick and dirty sort of run through of what's going on in Japan after World War II, just to put us in the right mindset and give us some perspective. So as you know, at the end of World War II, the United States drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Okay, so we drop bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and just slaughter all of those people, which were all civilians, elderly people, children, women, and totally destroy all the buildings. It's just total devastation. And so when this happens, Japan surrenders. So Japan surrenders on August 14th, 1945. Okay? So what this looks like is Japan accepts what's called the Potsdam Declaration. Emperor Hirohito announces their unconditional surrender, and he agrees to this declaration, and then he announces the surrender on all the broadcasts on the radios throughout Japan, so they all know that they have surrendered to the Allied forces. Okay, and they had an emperor up at this time. That's an important thing to know, is that they were an empire. They had an emperor, Hirohito. Okay, so this is known in U.S. history as VJ Day, right, which is Victory over Japan Day. And it marks the end of World War II. Okay? So that's something that's kind of, I feel like, pretty known in terms of history. You know World War II happened. You know that it kind of ended when we dropped atomic bombs on Japan. What I don't know, what kind of varies in terms of people's knowledge and experience, is if you know what happened to Japan after they surrendered. So we're just going to talk about that for just a little bit, and then we'll get into the artwork. So Allied occupation, which is the Allied forces, it's like the United States and Britain and Russia, right? So Allied occupation begins in Japan on August 28th, 1945. So they surrender on August 14th. Then 14 days later, so 2 weeks later, here come all the Americans, the Allied forces occupying Japan. So President Truman, who was the president of the United States at the time, he's the only U.S. president to ever come from Missouri, by the way, living in Missouri. There's a little Missouri history for you. So President Truman makes this guy named Douglas MacArthur, he's a general, and he makes him SCAP. So what is SCAP? That's the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, which is kind of a scary title, right? So this general is in charge of overseeing the occupation of Japan. a lot of things happen as a result of the Allied forces occupation of Japan, the United States occupation of Japan. And I'm not going to go into all of them because it's a huge cultural change, it's a political change, it impacts their culture a lot in kind of every aspect of life. And they don't have any choice about this, okay? So one of the things that happens is they disarm. So they aren't allowed to have a standing army. They aren't allowed to have weapons. The United States and the Allied occupation forces become the army in Japan, okay? There's a lot of emphasis in the government and the way things are restructured there on economic stability and growth. In 1946, the Americans draft a new constitution for Japan. So again, this is like very heavy-handed restructuring kind of the whole way their society works. Excuse me. The results of this new constitution are lots and lots of changes. And this is based kind of heavily on documents and ideas and things that exist in the United States. So the Bill of Rights is a big influence, and also the New Deal, the work that kind of was liberalizing government's role in society in America at the time is sort of emulated in Japan. So one of the things that results from this is democratization. So they had an emperor. That is no longer the case. They're going to vote and have a prime minister. One of the things that happens is women are more enfranchised, so women are allowed to vote, which was not the case. I mean, no one was voting, but women are allowed to vote, which is a big deal. They abolished the Shinto doctrine. So the Shinto doctrine was basically established a state religion. So the religion of Japan and its people was Shinto, and that was just the religion you were in Japan. And so that's abolished, so people don't have to practice that particular religion anymore. And then a prime minister is elected, and that is Shigeru Yoshida, the first prime minister of Japan, who you probably are familiar with that name. He's kind of an important historical figure. Okay, so all of that happened. So big things are happening. So think about this from the perspective of the Japanese people. You learn that atomic bombs exist. This is brand new, and that they can cause insane destruction. Then you no longer have an army. You're occupied by these foreign people who are totally restructuring your government, your society, and everything you know about life. So, though a lot of the things that come out of this are good things, some of them are not so good, but a lot of them are good things. It's just a complete shakeup. It's just crazy. Everything's kind of topsy-turvy for people living in Japan at this time. So it's sort of a wild time to be a Japanese citizen. And artists at this time are obviously going to be impacted by this as well, simply because of all the big societal changes and shakeup, but also because these Allied forces figures are coming with ideas about what's happening in America, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the West. And that information influences the art because they become more exposed and more connected to this Western world and Western ideas about the art world. And one of the results of that is the Gutai Group. Okay, so here's some images of just sort of what's happening. We have the devastation of the atom bomb below. Then we have some headlines talking about what's happening in the occupation. We have this mom and her kids standing in Japan, in, I think, Kyoto. Okay, so on the scene we get the Gutai Group. So this is the Gutai Bijutsu Kyokai, which means the Gutai Art Association. And they're formed in 1954 in Osaka, Japan. Okay, and their forming members are Yoshihara Yaro, Kanaima Akira, Murakami Saburo, Shiraga Kazu, Shozzo Shimamoto, Atsuko Tanaka, and several other people, but those are kind of the main members. Gutai, the word Gutai translates in English roughly as embodiment or concrete. So it's kind of like this reinforcement, this kind of structure, and this like hard idea, basically. Yoshihara is an older artist, and he kind of finances this group. So he's the one, he's sitting in the lower left there, the older gentleman with the glasses closest to the frame. That's Yoshihara. Okay, so let's talk about some of these artists. So in their early public exhibitions in 1955 and 1956, Gutai artists create a series of really kind of shocking works of art. And they're sort of anticipating and looking forward to the development of happenings and performance art and conceptual art. So these are artworks that are like nothing anyone in Japan has ever seen. And this is one example. So this is Shiraga Kasu, and it's called Challenge in the Mud. It sometimes is translated as Challenge to the Mud, like he's actually challenging the mud itself. And this work involves the artist rolling around in the mud half naked. And it just completely shocks people. They've never seen anything like this. And part of what he's doing and what he's interested in is looking at how the movement of the body can create these kind of sculptural forms. Basically like how the soft medium of mud, when you're rolling around and punching and throwing it, it changes based on how you move. So it becomes kind of a temporary record of a motion that happened. Okay, so it's a very interest in direct recording of motion. So the performance, the action of the performance is kind of the concept, is the main piece of work, and the resulting disturbance in the mud and the shapes and patterns made in the mud by the performance are kind of a record of the artwork, a record of the performance. Okay, and so Shiraga goes on to develop these painting techniques where he's using his feet to paint, okay? And these are called his feet paintings. They're also sometimes called his suspended paintings. And so at first, this image on the right shows him just directly with his feet walking and sliding in the paint on the canvas on the floor. The one on the left is what he develops this technique into. So in his studio or in the performance space, he does it in both places, in his studio and sometimes in where the actual exhibition is. He suspends a rope from the ceiling, and he grabs onto the rope, and he runs across the canvas and swings and moves his feet and runs around and slides. And basically what he's doing is he's recording the movement of his body, of his feet, on the canvas. So the performance is the actual like throwing and running. And when he describes this, he describes the energy he puts into it to be like running into battle, like pushing forward and running forward. And it's this very frenetic, very charged, energetic, kind of violent sort of action. And so then the paint on his feet and the canvas below capture the movement. So they're really kind of a documentation, and the process of making the painting, of swinging around and running his feet, is where the other part of the artwork is. Okay, so here's just a look. Here's a more contemporary image of some of the resulting paintings of those being displayed in a gallery, just so you can see them and get kind of an idea of the scale. They're quite large. And then let's look at this one a little bit more in depth. So this painting is a little bit later than the previous images. This is in 1962, and those images were from 1956. But it's the same technique, so he's still doing this technique. You can see the connection to action painting and abstract expressionism, right? This is what's happening in the West. This is a big influence. So we have Jackson Pollock doing his drip paintings, his action paintings, his interest in all-over painting that doesn't care about the borders of the canvas, non-narrative painting, non-objective painting, abstract expressionism. So we can see a connection there, right? Because this is kind of even more directly absorbing and tracking the movement of the body. It isn't being flung from a stick, it's his literal body making the marks. So you can totally see that connection. You also can see the connection to ideas in modernism about materiality. So about the fact that this is aware that this is a painting, it's aware that there's paint, it's aware that there's a surface. It's not trying to make it look like something it isn't. It's utilizing the medium for its viscosity and its ability to make marks. So very much some formalist ideas there, right? It also has this emotional quality, right? This kind of expressive emotional quality. We have this red, we have these kind of violent splatters. You can see the frenetic energy of his movement. So this kind of painting really fits right in with abstract expressionism and what's happening. But it combines the performative aspect of it as a process and as being part of the work itself. So let's talk about the artist who made these. Shirga is an artist who studied art. So he's born in 1924, first of all. He dies in 2008. Here's another picture of him in his studio working. And he's formally trained. So he goes to Kyoto City University of Arts, and there he studies Nihonga, which is like traditional Japanese painting. So traditional Japanese calligraphy painting, which is the writing, and traditional Japanese style painting, which is this kind of very flat kind of landscape. Sometimes there are figures, kind of a muted palette, very sort of very traditional kind of work. So he's kind of classically trained in this Japanese style painting. After he graduates, he starts a group called Zero Kai, Kai, and he starts this group in 1953 with Atsuko Tanaka, Akira Kanayama, and Saburo Murakami. And they have a lot of the same ideas as Gutai. And when they discover the Gutai movement, they merge with them, because as I said, Gutai was they had a more established artist in there that was kind of bankrolling them. So they have similar ideas, so they all merge together and become the Gutai Group. And that's in 1954. One of you is writing about Atsuko Tanaka's electric dress. We'll talk about her at the end of the lecture a little bit more. She's a really fascinating artist. Excuse me. So from 1956 to 1966, so 10 years, these performance paintings, these performance kind of feat paintings, are his main type of work. And this is what he becomes very known for. There's been new interest in the last 10 years looking back on this work and how important it was culturally to the progression of abstract artworks. And then he takes kind of a wild turn after doing this for 10 years. From 1971 to 1972, he decides to live as a Buddhist monk. So he goes to a Buddhist monastery and lives as a monk, and his paintings change pretty drastically during this time. He starts making paintings, instead of on canvas, he's working on wood, and he's working with this flat scraper. It's kind of like a squeegee that you use to clean a window, but it's wooden, but it's that same kind of shape. Or if anyone's ever made crepes, the thing that you make crepes with, it's similar to that. So these works, he's still interested in color, obviously, though a little bit more muted. He's still very much interested in motion and in capturing motion on the painting. So the painting is a document of the motion. But instead of being this frenetic whole body charging into battle kind of work, while he's living as a monk, he's more interested in these quieter kind of motions. So this sort of almost meditative kind of motions just with the hand, not with the whole body. And a lot of them have this circular kind of pattern to them, which, if you know anything about Buddhism, this idea of this perfect circle is a thing in Buddhism, basically. Using this flat scraper to make this kind of work, and the kind of mark making and kind of smudged color that it makes really reminds me of another artist called Gerhart Richter. He's a German artist. He is still living. We'll talk about him maybe later. But he does work in this kind of similar vein, though his are very flat. He doesn't usually do circles. So it's a kind of technique that is being utilized in Western art as well. Okay, so let's talk about another guy. So this is Murakami Saburo, and this work is called Laceration of Paper. This work in Japanese is called Kami Yaburi, which literally means piercing of paper, laceration of paper. And this is a groundbreaking performance piece, happening piece for the Gutai Group. So this is another groundbreaking piece that no one had seen anything like this. Kind of like the piece in the mud, right? The challenge to the mud. They were debuted the same time at the same show, the same happening in 1955 with the Gutai Group. So we have someone rolling around in the mud, and that mud is recording the movements of the person. This is kind of doing the same thing, right? So this is a guy running through a bunch of pieces of paper that are stretched in these frames, and as he runs through them with his body, the tearing of the paper, the piercing of the paper is recording where he has been, and is recording this motion. But the destruction is more evident here, right, than in the mud. So this is an example of creating by destroying, and the sort of tension between creation and destruction, which is one of the kind of cornerstone fascinations of the Gutai Group. Okay, so that's one of the things that Murakami is really known for. He's a pretty interesting guy. So he's born in Kobe, Japan in 1925. If Kobe sounds familiar, you might be someone who really likes to eat beef. I do not eat beef, but my understanding is that Kobe beef is like the best beef for eating in the world. So that is where this artist is from. And his dad is a teacher. His dad was an English teacher. He had several siblings. I think he had like 6 siblings, so a big household. And he studied art at Kwansei Gakunin University. He graduates in 1948, and he becomes an elementary school teacher. So he's an elementary school art teacher, and he teaches throughout his life. He has this arts practice, but he's also a teacher. So he teaches elementary school for a long time, and then I think he teaches high school for a while, and then eventually he teaches in college at the collegiate level. So he's a performance artist who's important and a painter, but he's also a teacher. So he, after he graduates, when he's an elementary school teacher, he meets Shiraga and joins the Zero Kai group that he was in with Atsuko Tanaka. So they're all in this group together, and then they meet the Gutai artists, and they merge with them together. He also made performance work where he threw balls of ink or paint at canvas so it would splatter. So he did things like that as well, and there's another artist who becomes more famous for that kind of work that we'll look at in a minute. But he did that kind of work, and again, that we can see a connection to action painting, to abstract expressionism, to what's going on in the West, right? This idea of throwing paint to create an image is something that's very much in keeping with ideas about action painting and all over painting and drip painting that Jackson Pollock is doing, right? So another thing that he did were paintings like this. So this is another painting that really emphasizes this interest in materiality, in what the paintings are made of, and in this idea of creation and destruction being linked. So in these paintings, he mixed the paint in such a way that it would peel and crack and discolor and flake off. So he did it using resin and oil paints together that didn't really go well together. So as the painting ages, it will destroy itself. It will change and destroy the original image. He called these auto-destructing paintings. And he did this for a few reasons. One of the things is this idea about destruction and creation. And one of the other ideas is that he believed that a worn, deteriorated quality in the work offered a more authentic presence of the material. And this awareness of the materiality is a very modernist idea. So this is again going back to these modernist ideas about what the painting is made out of, ideas about process, and this is a way to make the process keep going without the hand of the artist, which is something that Gutai were very interested in as a group. And so this idea of making this painting that would kind of self-destruct over time was a another thing that he's kind of known for. Okay, let's look at somebody else. This is Shozzo Shimamoto. I love Shozzo Shimamoto. He lives until 2013, so we have these great photos of him, and he kept making work pretty much right up until he died. He was kind of an incredible artist and an incredible personality and individual. So he's an important Gutai artist. These are some photos of him toward the end of his life. So this top one, we have him in a gallery with some of his artworks where he's kind of posing, and then the one below is one of him at a performance he did in Italy toward the end of his life, where he did this massive painting. And there's actually on Canvas, I linked a video of that performance, so you can watch him creating this painting, and it's pretty cool. Okay. So, although he's most famous for his performance pieces, which are called crash bottle paintings, which is what is happening here. So he's most famous for those, but he actually began his work with the Gutai Group in a very different way. So I want to look at one of those paintings as well. This is from a series called Holes, and he made these between 1949 and 1955, and they were made using many sheets of newspaper. So he would take newspapers and layer them up and then put brown cartridge paper, butcher paper on top. And he would glue them all together using a glue that's made from mixing flour with water. Does that sound familiar to anybody? The glue mixing flour with water. Any vandals in the house? Anyone engaging in some graffiti? Okay, so wheat paste is a graffiti technique, a street art technique where you take images on paper and then you paste them to walls, to buildings outside. That's wheat pasting, and what you use to make wheat paste is flour and water. So this is a different use of wheat paste, which becomes kind of a big thing in the late 70s, 80s, through the 90s. People still wheat paste today. Anyway, so Shimamoto is using wheat paste to create the substrate that he makes these works on, which are just layered newspaper on wood or cardboard, and then brown paper on top. Anyway, he paints them with blue and white paint, so this very limited palette and this kind of soft palette, and then he cuts into them to reveal the layers beneath. So they're really hard to appreciate in a slide. You kind of need to see them in person. But I think they're just beautiful. I think they're really gorgeous paintings. And they have this sort of ethereal quality about them where they have this soft kind of meditative feeling to them when you first look at them. And then when you get close to them, you see that they have these like violent gouges in them, you know, that they've been cut and pierced and kind of torn away to reveal what's below, which creates this really interesting kind of tension and contrast in the work. So we have the contrast between the delicate hues of the painting that are very appealing and very calm, and then the violence that's used to make them. So again, it's this dichotomy between creation and destruction that is sort of an earmark of Gutai, right? So we have this relationship that emerges between violence and order, between this sort of destruction and beauty, which when you think about where we are in the history of Japan, it kind of makes sense. So Japanese society pre-World War II was very much focused on these ideas of order, right? And then everything gets totally turned upside down after the Allied occupation. So this idea of the relationship between destruction and order makes a lot of sense, that that's something that's going to keep popping up in the artwork, right? And he begins working on newspaper substrates because he couldn't afford canvas at the time. So he was very poor, couldn't afford canvas, so he invents his own kind of substrate, which leads to him creating this technique, because he notices that it's easy to tear when he's sticking it together. So that leads to this exploration of this medium and this process, which again, process-oriented, material-oriented, over and over again, are things that we hear when we think, when we talk about Gutai. He's a student of Yoshihara, who was kind of the leader of the Gutai Group. Okay, he was kind of his mentor, So he gets involved with Gutai, and he becomes, Shimamoto becomes the secretary of the group. So like a lot of these movements in modernism, they have a manifesto, they have meetings. So he's the guy who's appointed as the secretary who takes notes during their meetings when they're kind of discussing what their philosophy and everything is going to be. So as the secretary, he's very involved. And he also is actually the one who named the group Gutai. So he's the one who came up with the name, which is kind of rad. Okay. Here is an image, the earliest image of him doing one of his crash bottle paintings. This is in 1956, so the year after the paper laceration and the mud challenge performances. So this is another kind of performance. And this is where he takes glass bottles, fills them all with different colors of paint, different pigments, and then he runs and throws them at the canvas on the ground so they burst and the paint goes everywhere. So again, it's kind of using the paint to record an action, right? To record this motion. And it has a relationship to violence. It kind of makes you think of like a Molotov cocktail, right? An exploding bottle thrown through a window, or a bomb going off. So it has a very direct relationship to kind of the violence that happens before the Gutai movement begins. And it also is very interested in this performance being part of the work, this kind of conceptual work, and the painting afterwards is just sort of an artifact of that performance. It's a document of the performance. And he continues making these kind of works throughout his life. This is another image. This is him, I think this is from the 70s, so you can see him in his full suit with his boots and his mask and his goggles, so the broken glass doesn't, hurt him. So this is him doing more of these crash bottle paintings, and he has, he evolves his setup to where he has canvas on the floor capturing the image, but he also will have canvases or pieces of gessoed wood set up around that he's throwing against the sides and on the floor, so it's kind of creating this whole performance is caught in all these different multifaceted substrates. So he continues doing these works throughout his life, and they just get bigger and bigger in scale. So check out the video I posted of his performance in Italy from toward the end of his life. Okay, the last person I'm going to talk about, one of you is writing about her, so I don't want to say too much about her, but I do want to talk about Atsuko Tanaka. So she's born in 1932 and she dies in 2005. Excuse me. She was born in Osaka and she studied at the Kyoto Municipal College of Art. But unlike our previous artist, she was not trained in traditional Japanese painting. She actually studied Western painting. So she is trained in Western style painting, but this is still like more like painters in the Renaissance, more like kind of a classically trained, more traditional kind of painting. But that is what she studies in school. She actually leaves the Kyoto College and ends up going to the Osaka Municipal Museum, their art institute, but she finishes her degree there, and as I said, she studies Western painting. She's significant for a lot of reasons. She's kind of an incredible artist and really groundbreaking in a lot of ways. But one of the things that she's really known for is her use of everyday objects. And that kind of connects us to another artist we've talked about, Marcel Duchamp, and his ready-mades and found object art, right? So she's doing that kind of work, but in Japan, and she involves the objects that she uses in more of a performance capacity. So she's kind of on the same conceptual page as Duchamp in terms of found art and ready-made kind of things, but she involves her body, and she involves the audience, and she is creating much more of a performance-based work with these found objects. She also does painting, so these are some of her circuit paintings up above. One of you is writing about her electric dress, which is an incredible work. It's probably my favorite Gutai work. It's very rad, so I won't talk about it because one of you is writing about it. But I do want to talk to you about a different one of her works that was really groundbreaking. Excuse me. So this work is called Belle, and it's made in 1956. This is a photograph of part of the original installation. And then here is a more contemporary photograph of it being reinstalled. So it was originally made in 1956. It's still shown in museums, so it still is installed from time to time. I like this image because it's a little more clear. So this work consisted of a string of 20 electric bells, okay, and a button that was on the wall. And the button had a little sign next to it that said, "Please feel free to push the button, Atsuko Tanaka." So it says, "Please feel free to push the button," next to a button signed by the artist. And when this button is pushed, it makes all 20 of these bells ring in sequence for 2 solid minutes. 2 minutes is kind of a long time. Sit down and time 2 minutes, and then think about a siren-like bells all over a gallery going off for that long of a time. So why is this work important? Why is this something that I'm talking to you about? It's important for a lot of reasons. First of all, what is the number one rule when you're in a museum or a gallery? Like, what is thing one? Don't touch the art, right? Don't touch the art is the big rule. If you ever went to museums or galleries as a kid, your parents were probably like, "Please don't touch the art, don't touch that, don't touch that, don't touch that." There's a whole staff at a museum to make sure that you don't touch anything. So it's taboo, right? To touch the art. You don't touch the art. Well, what is the first thing that she is inviting the audience to do? Touch the art. And she says it in a really formal way. There's an official little sign right next to the button that says, "Touch this, please touch this," which is exciting, right? Because it seems like we're connecting directly to the artist. We're being allowed to do something that we're not supposed to do, but maybe we always kind of want to touch the art. And she's saying, do it, touch the art. So then you do it, and these crazy alarm bells start going off everywhere, which creates this intense kind of anxiety, like, oh no, I did something wrong, but the sign told me to. So it creates this sort of distressed reaction, right? So that's thing one, is she invites us to touch the art, which is not normally allowed. Thing two is that you touching the button, you doing what the sign says and touching the button is what activates the work. It's what finishes the piece. You as an audience member become an active part of the work. You're helping complete it and create it. And this is a pretty new concept, this idea that the audience is part of the work, is part of the creation. And not just in a passive way, like you going in and looking at something and having your own feelings and thoughts about it is part of the work. This is very active. The main part of the work is the sound, and if you don't touch it, it doesn't happen, the work fails. So you become complicit in the completion of this work, which also means that you're complicit in creating this very disturbing, loud alarm bell noise, which is uncomfortable. So it's not just your action completing it, it also is kind of your feelings and your reaction to it that become part of the work. The third thing that is groundbreaking and important about this work is that it's predominantly a sound installation. This is 1956. The idea of an artwork, a visual fine arts work, being predominantly made of sound is a new idea. People are not there yet. This isn't a thing that becomes commonplace until the late 70s. So Atsuko Tanaka is doing something that's very forward-thinking and unheard of at her time. Okay, so it's a really big deal. Now, if you go to any museum that has a contemporary wing, has a contemporary gallery, or you go to most of the galleries in LA or New York, you're very often going to see sound installations. Soundscapes, sound installations are a big part of the contemporary art world. They're a big thing. But in 1956, no one had heard of that. So this is a really groundbreaking, important work for those three reasons, but also it's weird and smart and shocking and kind of really engage the audience. The other thing you're thinking about is, you have to think about is putting yourself in the context. This is, 10 years after the atomic bombs. So this loud siren going off would be particularly jarring and alarming. It's like, oh no, they're bombing us again. What's happening? So it's this really interesting work. It's really groundbreaking and really forward-thinking, but also very responsive to the atmosphere of fear in the culture at the time. So Atsuko Tanaka is pretty cool, was pretty rad, and was definitely thinking way before her time. And I look forward to reading whichever one of you is writing about her electric dress, which is another groundbreaking, incredible work. There's more Gutai artists. I just want to give you kind of a taste of them and of what it is that they're doing. So I'm going to leave off there and enjoy the rest of the lecture. So I look forward to seeing what you think about this one.